course, I do have an acronym. The first aim is articulating the impact of anti-trans and anti-gender expression laws. You'll often hear me say anti-gender expression in place of anti-trans and anti-non-binary and anti-gender diverse, because oftentimes in these discussions and in these discourses, a sort of a trick and sort of a tactic is, sort of minimizing. There's not this many anti-trans laws because this law is actually tailored to drag queens or drag kings or somebody in public who's expressing their gender in this way. And that's also like you're sort of threading the needle and sort of making a case that isn't very strong, because these laws that are actually seeking to restrict gender expression impact trans people, impact non-binary people, both present and future, right? And so you can't really, I like to use the word anti-gender expression because it encapsulates the full breadth of these laws and how much of an impact it has on public life in general, right? I'm also going to introduce a few strategies for us to challenge transphobia as it shows up in our lives. And I'm also going to encourage us and lead us through a choosing of a strategy that most resonates with you and that you sense would be the most useful for you when you are in a situation where you need to employ a strategy to challenge transphobia, right? I can't see the chat, but if this is okay with you, if you think these are good aims, give me a thumbs up or put a nice yes in the chat just to let me know that I still got y'all. But we're gonna keep it pushing, right? But also, I do want to also acknowledge that part of my practice, my equity practice, is to not enter into these spaces with the presumption that I am an expert or that I am the leading voice. I am a voice. I am a practitioner. I'd like to say that I am literate in these languages of identities. And that does not mean that I am the one voice. And so, if there's a question that you have throughout, or if you would like to share a story, or something particularly resonates with you and you would like to chime in, please, I welcome you to also, because this is a conversation amongst equals, right? And so I just wanted to mention that before we go on, right? Okay, so the first thing that I love to do with people is talk about how rapid and how expansive and really unprecedented the slate of anti-gender expression laws and legislations and efforts have been in the last few years, right? I guess I'm not gonna name names, but there's a popular news clip of a former president, I'll just say that, who recently came out at one of his rallies and said, transgender, 5 years ago, you wouldn't even know what transgender was. And now that I say transgender, everybody screams and everybody's excited, right? And he's sort of joking and sort of making fun of his followers, right? But he's onto something there, right? Like there's a very sudden, very quick bubbling up of anti-gender expression legislation sentiment. And that's made manifest in the form of these legislations and these laws that are largely been passed or promoted by ALEC, which is an acronym that stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council. Some of us have heard about them in the past, and they're really a very well-funded grassroots organization that facilitates and empowers the almost blitz of these legislations, because a lot of them are copies of one another, right? They just sort of, you change a word here and there, you change the name of a state, you change some of the things around the edges, but an analysis would tell you that a lot of these laws are very expansive and very similar to one another. And so that's facilitated the passing and the introduction of over 800 laws that have been proposed just in the last few years, right? And so at a time when, the political system within the continental United States, the imperial core of the United States, is marked by gridlock, we're seeing very fast movement when it comes to these legislations. And they have a lot of impacts, not just on people who these laws are tailored to, because these laws are actually very broad. And some of the laws have actually been struck down by courts, largely because the Supreme Courts of some of these states have ruled that the laws are too broad and not narrowly tailored, right? And so that makes it very difficult to actually enforce these laws, right? But one of the impacts, and I'll go over some of the impacts in particular as it relates to young people, because they are a larger percentage of the transgender and non-binary population within the United States. But one of the impacts that it has is just causing a chilling effect on people, right? So it's causing people to question whether or not it's quote unquote worth it to express their gender, whether or not it makes sense for their safety and their well-being to explore their gender identity, to experience what it's like to change their clothing or transition, either medically, socially. It's making it very difficult. And in some cases, families are being broken up, right? And some legislation in Florida and other states, laws are being passed and have been passed that make it perfectly legal, or at least gives cover to people who would like to take children away from their parents if the powers that be have decided that the parents in some way or shape or form have encouraged their children to pursue transition in some way, shape, or form. The same goes with doctors and medical practitioners. Many of these laws and legislations are having to do with the realm of the law as it relates to medication, as it relates to hormones, as it relates to other things. I don't like to get into the nitty-gritty of the particular medicalization of trans and non-binary rights, because I think that it skips a few steps and also obscures the reality that we're dealing with people, we're dealing with relationships. These laws are, while they may say that they're trying to prevent children from accessing this medication or that hormone, or prevent people, we're seeing that they have ripple effects, not only in the lives of children and their parents and their families and schools, but also in adults. In one legislation, one law actually prevented people from accessing hormones until they were 26 if they were on their parents' insurance, right? So we're seeing these laws and these legislations have an oversized impact, and that's causing it to be very scary. Another big issue is that it's actually eroding the sense of trust that Americans have in what they can expect out of their experiences. There's a school of thought that talks about how essentially a lot of what it comes down to equity is the relationship between what somebody expects and what their experience is, right? Many of us have expectations that have been drilled into us, that we have been conditioned to, that we should expect different things than those who have more unearned advantages, such as whiteness, such as being born in a male identified body, right? And others are expected to have most of their expectations met, right? And so I really resonate with that school of thought that, the extent to which your expectations are reinforced and lived out by your experiences and your lived in your day-to-day life is sort of a shorthand for equity, or at least a very good indicator of equity, right? But these laws are challenging what people thought were their expectations when it came to gender identity. And it's happening at a time when we don't have a strong lexicon or a foundation, especially young people, for what it means to be non-binary, what it means to be trans, what their rights are and what their rights are not, right? And so in a lot of cases with civil rights legislation and social justice laws and efforts, there's already a strong framework of what you can expect your rights to be. And some of the reactions, but in this case, we don't really even know as a society what we believe in when it comes to a transgender person or a non-binary person or gender diverse person's rights in the public space. And so we're seeing kind of a preemption that is eroding what you already been on as quicksand, right? It's one thing to be on solid ground and to have your solid footing chipped away bit by bit. And we saw this recently with the removal of affirmative action, right? Like people thought they had something and then it was taken away by the Supreme Court. This is happening, this onslaught of anti-transgender, anti-gender expression laws is happening to a population that does not have that strong foundation, right? And so we're going to be seeing the effects of that also. I know that I just threw a lot at you all. And so I also want to just pause and ask if there's anything that resonates, any questions that people might have, any things that are coming up for you all. And so one thing I did want to note is there are no federal legal protections for people who are identified as transgender or non-binary outside of very limited workplace and housing protections, right? And so, especially in the case of the ruling from the Supreme Court that just came out, they talked about hypothetically, does a person who is a website designer, do they have to support or reify or affirm LGBTQ plus identity because it's their artistic expression? So that law, I'm married to a lawyer, and so we have conversations about the legal ramifications of that and what it means for social justice. That law, that ruling, has a lot of implications, right? So we're seeing almost a 1-2 punch when it comes to these rights and these legislation and these efforts. And so I'm going to go into more detail about what it is that is the impact of these laws and legislations, and then we're going to go into a little bit about what it is that we can all do, irregardless almost of our social positionality in response to these efforts. All right. One last chance before somebody jump in. Okay. All right. So we're going to keep it pushing here. I like to read this quote also because I think it's really important because, I give these presentations to a lot of different audiences, and many of them are parents or people who are in an older generation. And to them, and this is, I think, reflects social media's influence and also a little bit of their perspective and their vantage point. To them, there's an explosion of transgender people. There's an explosion of non-binary people, and it can be offsetting, right? I'm going to be talking a little bit about trust and what that looks like. But people find predictability comforting. They find stability comforting. They find certainty comforting. And so America is as attached to its racial formations and its racial norms as it is to its gender norms, right? And so when something is shifting their perceived gender norms, people can feel like they're losing grip with what's happening, and they can feel frightened, and they can respond with animosity, with confusion, with anger, with rejection, right? And especially when people have historically not been given much agency to direct other aspects of their lives, economics, their workplaces, et cetera. Something like the transgender problem in their eyes can be a very useful avenue for expressing the pent-up frustration that they have with many other situations that they feel like they can't actually control, right? And so in that way, the political system targets the ire of the populace towards a particular issue, and that's part of the reason why we're seeing such a huge increase when it comes to visibility of transgender and non-binary people in public life, in media, in discussions online. But there's a quote that I really like that says, it's not an increase that we're seeing of transgender and non-binary people, it's more of disclosure of non-binary and trans identity because we are more inclusive about gender and how we're asking about it. And I liken this to the revolution of left-handed people that we are seeing, that we saw in the 60s and 70s, once we stopped demonizing people being left-handed. It's not that people who are left-handed just automatically exploded. It's that people stopped being stigmatized for being left-handed, right? And I also make the point that after people got the ability to be left-handed in public and not have any negative social consequences, we saw a subsequent revolution and explosion in things like left-handed scissors and left-handed resources and other tools, right? Because those people felt able to speak about their needs more publicly, and their expectations about having their needs met shifted, right? And so we're seeing the same struggle happening with transgender and non-binary identity currently taking place. So these are just some statistics. I won't read off all of them, but for those who benefit from some time to just process and read to themselves, I will offer about 10, 20 seconds of time for you to read them quietly. Okay. And if you need me to go back, just let me know. And these are just a few reports from the Trevor Project. Every year they do an annual survey of tens of thousands of students and young people from all over the United States who identify as transgender or non-binary, to get understandings of what their experiences are like and what their most prescient challenges are when it comes to public life. And so this one talks about the rates of discrimination, and it breaks it down rather usefully, I would add, by transgender boy or man, transgender girl or woman, and non-binary gender queer, right? And the rates of discrimination that they self-report, okay? And so what we see with these survey results is a very serious impact that it is having on the lives of transgender young people in particular. And to go back to what I said earlier, the reason why I am making space for transgender and non-binary and gender queer, gender variant youth is because they are a larger proportion of the transgender non-binary identities and peoples within the United States. We are seeing a large contingency of Generation Z and also Generation Alpha. They're a little too young for us to survey them on this, but if trends hold, the next two generations will be already and will be significantly more non-binary and trans than millennials, than baby boomers, than the silent generation, and so forth, right? And so our institutions will need to make some preparations right now if they are to meet the needs of these populations currently. We're already seeing some tensions right now currently with the oldest Gen Zers who are currently in the workplace. And part of the reasons why they're having frustrations is because the workplace as it is currently designed and orchestrated and initiated within the United States and other Western countries does not take into account the variance of gender expression, right? But the leading concerns for trans and non-binary youth and people in the United States includes discrimination, right? We saw that up to 91% of trans and non-binary youth fear being discriminated against in public life, right? They are worried about bullying, right? They're worried about accessing healthcare, which is incredibly, incredibly important. And they're concerned about and are negatively impacted by issues with mental health, right? A struggle to access mental health care that both affirms their gender identity and understands them. And I also would like to add that these concerns are even more so concentrated amongst transgender and non-binary people of color, right? So we're seeing the reports of higher rates of suicide, the reports of higher rates of self-harm, of concern, of worry and bullying is even more concentrated with transgender and non-binary people. So I encourage folks on the call and those listening to also do some research and to access the Trevor Project's 2023 and 2022 reports. And troublingly, we're seeing the rates of concern increase. And so I also would like to take a pause and just sort of ask if anyone has any questions or if there was anything that was just shared that resonates with you or sort of reflects an experience or concern that you have in your personal life or your career.
Hi, this is Jody. I have a quick question. When you say youth, what's the age range for youth? Is it like 13 to 19? Is it teen? Is youth considered 20s? Like what is the youth age range?
Yeah, for that's a great question. Thank you. The population for this study is primarily adolescents, right? And so roughly 12 to 13 to 19 years old is the target group for the Trevor Project's research. Now, the Human Rights Campaign does a similar survey that is more expansive of people who are in their early adulthood years, right? And that's for a different reason because the population is a little different. And I can share those statistics also if you'd like me to via email after this. But that's a good question, right? And
Oh,
the reason
yeah, no.
why, oh, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just gonna say, no, that's just I was just curious when because you were saying that it was like the larger population, and I was like, well, I wonder what age group that is, like what age
Yeah,
range. So that's perfect. That answers my question.
thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jody. All right, going once. All right, we're gonna keep it pushing. Okay, and so I mentioned that we're going to be introducing strategies, and so this is the point where we're going to be introducing strategies. uh, so I'd like to take a step back and sort of say that I just shared a lot of information that might be overwhelming. It might be, to some people frightening, might be sort of concerning, and deeply troubling, especially for those of us who have deep relationship with trans and non-binary people who identify as trans or non-binary, and love people who are young people, right? It's completely natural to be concerned about our young people and the future that we are currently building for them, right? And I also like to take a step back and pause and root myself and ground my equity practice in the 6 core needs. So these needs are adapted from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a theory that he published in psychology, in the Journal of Psychology in the 1940s. And what is very little spoken about or even understood is Maslow was struggling to articulate his understanding of self-actualization, primarily by studying the Western populations, people within the United States. And he was finding it difficult to find examples of people who were self-actualized. He had a theory, but he couldn't really confirm it. And so he turned to, actually, interestingly, the Siksika Blackfoot Nation, which is located primarily in what is now Canada. And he spent 6 weeks there with this First Nations people, and learned about their practice of community actualization and saw examples of people who were healthy and were loved and were appreciated and were valued. And that inspired him, and he learned from their ways. And from that, um, in large part, resulted the hierarchy of needs, right? And people over the years have taken the hierarchy of needs, which is a largely self-actualized orientation when it comes to actualization. And they talked about the core needs. I have chosen to, in honor of the Siksika Nation, the Blackfoot Nation's wisdom, reorient these core needs in relation to how the community can create almost a nest of a space that is affirming of these needs within the individual so that the individual can become actualized and ultimately, and this is what the Blackfoot Nation talks about, give to the community and reinvest in the community and the continuation of the community, right? And so as we are seeing the results of hyper individualization and atomization within the United States, I think that it's an opportunity and there's true value in taking a step back with equity work and diversity work and inclusion work, to take a step back to really understanding at the core, people have core human needs, right? And we can learn about these needs and we can understand how these needs might differ depending on culture. Some people come from a low context culture, some people come from a high context culture, some people are trans, some people are cisgender, and their needs are slightly different. But what is the same is that they have these needs, right? And so I found really a lot of value and a lot of agency with using this orientation to really use as a map for equity problems or equity concerns, right? And so we start with trust. which is a person's sense of certainty, safety, and stability within their life. Then self-esteem, which is their internal sense of value, agency, how much power and ability they have to influence their life and their lived experiences. Belonging, how much somebody feels able to connect to, relate to, and feel acceptance by the people within their sphere, within their social space. Mastery, which is their ability to grow and learn and succeed at any given task or set of tasks. And ultimately purpose, which is, I really love purpose, talking about a person's sense of meaning and their ability to contribute to that sense of meaning, right, in a way that they find affirming. And so I talk about these 6 core human needs as a precursor, right? Because a lot of times people, they hear these really scary statistics and they see these very concerning trends when it comes to things like transgender visibility and the backlash. And they think, I can't do anything. What am I going to do? I'm just one person. How could I possibly stem that tide? How could I possibly challenge it? And if I were to challenge it, how can I make sure that I'm doing it in a way that isn't going to cause bigger problems or isn't going to step on the toes of people that I'm trying to talk to or speak in affirmation of? And so I offer these 6 core needs as a map for that. Right? Are there any questions or clarification requests as it comes to these 6 core human needs? All right.
This isn't for me, Chris, but I did see
Yes.
in the chat, I saw that it says what range, I don't know if you answered this already, but what age range is youth? Which I think is a really good question. So
Yes.
I'm curious.
Yes. Adolescents, 12 to 19.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. The survey was given to people in high school. So, and I know people who are in high school who are 12. So that's the reason why I include 12. But like, well, that's not 12, but some people are 12 in high school. And some people are 19 or older in high school, right? But the survey was given to high school students across the United States.
Oh, okay, that's perfect. And then one quick follow-up. Do you have any data, maybe this will be towards the end. Do you have any data that also speaks about like, the slide where you showed us like the 3 different scenarios? And it had us just read that quietly. Do you have any data that talks about that same demographic or community of people from a faith-based lens? Because I'm actually working on something separately about that. Or would it be better if I scheduled time with you for that, if I was curious?
That's a great question. I don't have that information currently, and
Okay.
I haven't seen anything that would speak to that. And I would love to dive into that data. I don't think that the survey from the Trevor Project or the one from HRC, sort of elevates or focuses on that focus, but I think that that's a really interesting dichotomy because they have faith-based communities that are trans and gender inclusive have their own unique challenges that oftentimes don't have space in these conversations.
No, I'm going to set up separate time with you. That's awesome. I was just curious. Thank you.
No problem. All right. So we're going to talk through some of the quick things. So I say all that to say that the core 6 needs I like to use as a framework to say, oh, this person, it sounds like the concern is a lack of belonging. It sounds like their concern is an inability to relate to connect with, and to really sustain acceptance within a community, right? And so I think that's a really, really helpful framework. When I tell people, I hear oftentimes, well, Chris, what can I do? What can we do? And I tell them the 3 things that I oftentimes like to share with is, these are really big issues and really very heavy concepts. And the first thing I say is, it's okay to be uncertain. It's okay to be a little bit, frightened, to be a little bit, scared of taking a step, right? To many people, it can feel like they're jumping into diving into some waters, right? And some people, they're shark infested waters, right? They're afraid of being canceled. They're frightened of saying the wrong thing, especially in the age of social media, where what we say and what we do can live in perpetuity, right? And that can follow us, right? And also, I think part of that interpretation is not understanding their relationship with trans and non-binary people. They may not know people who are in their life that are trans or non-binary, or they may not know their particular needs, right? And so I just want to also just say that it's okay to be uncertain, and it's also, I also value the bravery of being uncertain and also pushing through that and trying to find ways to become more certain, right? The other thing is like challenging the norm, right? There are norms when it comes to gender identity, when it comes to expectations, right? Like we have, and it's really baked into our language, right? Like, oh, a tomboy, right? Like we don't have phrases like tom girl because the assumption is it's okay to be a boy or like boyish if you were assigned female at birth, but it really isn't okay or appreciated or valued or understandable if a boy, some person who's assigned male at birth, would like to explore or express their gender identity in ways that might be coded as feminine within the Western lens, right? And so challenging the norm, even with as simple as just like when somebody says something that's a little bit like, I don't know, that seems a little bit like, what's your evidence for that, right? Or saying something like, maybe saying, in my experience, this has been ... right? And even those qualifiers, right, are really, really valuable in terms of softening the ground for saying claims that could be coded as prescriptive, right? Oftentimes when people say things that they view as surely being descriptive, like it's just how things are, they are interpreted, especially depending on the people who have less power and less social advantage than the person who's stating this phrase, as being prescriptive, as the way that things should be, not just that they are this way, right? And so challenging the norm might seem like a small thing, and it has the impact of really softening the ground for planting seeds, right? And the last thing is encouraging authenticity, right? So if somebody is, authentically excitable, authentically interested in something that may not be coded or may not meet expectations of what somebody who has their gender expression or their body type would be interested in, that should be something that we allow for and we honor, right? We want people to be excited about things. We want people to find joy. We want them to really be excitable, right? Of course, if there are any situations that may be involving danger or breaking of boundaries or violating people's needs, and that's a whole other situation. And for people who are maybe you have a young boy who wants to wear a tutu and a Power Rangers hat for Halloween, okay, let Timmy wear what he wants to wear, right? And I think that's something that it sends a powerful message, right, to young people. And so there's a few more slides, but I also want to pause and see if there are any questions that might have entered into the chat, because when I'm presenting, I can't see the chat. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep us moving. The next thing, and people say, Chris, these are very simple things. One is, my strategy is I don't want to overcomplicate these things, right? There's this narrative that, if you are trying to challenge transphobia, that things are complicated, you got to do 10-point steps and this and that. And I think that it's a disservice when we traffic in or use primarily these overly abstract, complicated, descriptions and things like that. There's value in just sort of meeting people at a human level and using language that they understand and they can connect with. And so some of these strategies are just, I call it the LEARN method. Listen, educate, amplify and advocate people's voices, people you're in a relationship with, respect and reflect, and also naming the norm. I talked about this a little bit in the last slide, okay? People are speaking up. They're already speaking up, right? And listen to them and listen deeply, right? And not to listen to judge or listen to reflect, because oftentimes, especially for people who are cisgender, or another way of saying that is people who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth, the sex they were assigned at birth, when they hear somebody who's trans or non-binary or gender divergent say something about their lived experience, it's almost like this cultural myopia where they are filtering it based on their understanding of their lived experience, of their understanding of gender experiences, and filtering it in terms of whether or not it's going to be valid or is based in reality, right? Based in the norm, right? And so when somebody is deemed to have shared something or to have expressed something that is deemed, outside the norm or outside the boundaries, there are subtle ways that people will withhold reciprocity, right? And this really has to do with reciprocity. If somebody's sharing their story with you, if they're sharing their lived experience with you, they are sharing and trusting and exercising some agency, right? They're trying to really encourage you to accept them and affirm and respect what they have shared with you. And they're being vulnerable, right? And oftentimes, a way that power makes itself known and manifests in these situations is ideally there would be some reciprocity, right? The other person would affirm, the other person would acknowledge the vulnerability, the other person would listen and nod and say, I'm so sorry that happened. That sounds terrible. How can I support you? And oftentimes, because there is some discomfort with a person who is, not trans or not gender diverse, they will just not engage, right? We often see this sometimes, and people who are in the room or people of color who ever talk to, a white colleague about their issues at work or with race, that there may be some relations that they may relate to this idea of like, I'm talking to you and I'm being vulnerable and I'm not really feeling that you're fully listening or open to my experiences, right? And so I encourage people to really listen with not just their mind, but also their heart, right? And really sense the emotional gravity of what this person is really trying to say. Educate is something that I encourage people to do in relation, outside of relationship with trans and non-binary people, because it is very taxing. It can be very taxing for trans and non-binary people to educate our cisgender colleagues and peers and loved ones about our experiences. Oftentimes, I tell people like, well, how can I get education? Just be around your trans and non-binary people and see how they are. Listen to the way they are, see how they move around the world, see how they're moving, see how they're expressing themselves, and have some openness, right? And the trick with this is to not have an attachment to your preconceived notions of what gender norms are, right? What is or is not okay or appropriate. And I want to be mindful of time and also leave room for some questions. So I'll go through these a little bit more quickly, but amplifying and advocating is important. If you have more questions about that, please reach out to me. Respecting and reflecting is also important. Oftentimes when people come to you and say, hey, this was said and it made me uncomfortable, or I wasn't sure if I was safe in this moment, I wanted to share that with you. That can be tough to hear. That could be, as somebody who was assigned male at birth, I was socialized and raised as a boy. I have and I had internalized sexism. And there were times when, I was in my gender studies classes where women would talk to me and say, hey, when you say this thing, it makes me feel infantilized, or it makes me feel like you don't really respect my voice. And that was tough to hear at first. And I valued the person who was sharing that with me and my relationship with them. And I wanted to be in accountability with them. And so that fueled my reflection and commitment to doing better in the future, right? And naming the norm, I talked about that a little bit earlier, but essentially just like look around and really just question, like, why do we do this thing? Right? Like, if you're familiar with, like, if you ever heard like, oh, well, we'd love to have more gender neutral bathrooms, but, and like, it doesn't really go anywhere. Like people just sort of say, but, right? Like maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a leader or manager, oh, we'd love to have that, but, oh, we'd love to have our pronouns in our emails, but, oh, but, right? And that's one way of really sort of noticing the norm is sort of, it's interesting that this happens, right? And exercise some bravery in naming that norm, right? And you're not saying this is bad. You're more saying, I acknowledge, and I want to just state that I have noticed this thing that we're doing. And I think that we should maybe reflect and have some openness to it being different. One note of caution, though, with that is that often, in my experience at least, when you name the norm, what will happen is the people in power, or those who identify with the norm or who benefit from the norm being that way, will question your interpretation of it, will question your objectivity, and may also react very negatively, right, emotionally to this norm, right? And so you got to think about like the power dynamics that are at play, right? And these are all just recommendations and suggestions and offerings that I found valuable in my practice. And of course, I encourage you to sense and to feel and to think about which of these tactics most resonate with you and which don't, and exercise your agency in choosing which one you think is going to have the highest level of success for you, right, for your needs. And that goes into making a choice, right? So this is a graphic. I just read Dr. Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal, that talks about toxic cultures and the West and our relationship to our health. And it's really more, it talks about the power of emotions and how they impact our epigenetic expression, right? And how our experience of a place as being hostile to our very way of being has very negative consequences in our physical body, right? And so it's not just like, oh, this person's feelings, oh, this person's, sensitive. Yes, and that means their needs are not being met within this environment, right? And we're seeing that happen a lot with trans and non-binary and gender diverse people. But he talks about the sort of the tying in or the challenge between authenticity, being who you authentically are, and attachment to a particular space, right? The relationships we have, the belong. And I love combining different things. It's part of how I express my creativity. I sort of created a quadrant because I love quadrant graphs. And I created 4 different quadrants that can describe not necessarily how a culture is, but how a person who is marginalized might experience a culture, right? So you might experience a culture that you feel low belonging, right? There's very little effort of the people in the community to connect with you, to accept you, to relate to you. I describe that as low belonging. And on the other end of that spectrum is high belonging. People are accepting, they are warm, they are affirming, they validate, right? That's high belonging. And self-esteem, that's more of an internal orientation, right? That, of course, is impacted by how people have treated you up to that point. So if you have a low self-esteem, it is, I don't feel, or I have a shaky understanding of my value as a person. We often see this as it relates to people's understanding of, I deserve based on what I do, right? This is a core trauma response that I have been working on healing from my childhood, right? A lot of people who are African-American in the African-American tradition have heard something akin to, you've got to be twice as good to get half as much, right? And while that might have been a survival tactic for African Americans to pass on to the children, historically, not all, of course, I'm not going to paint with a broad brush, but it is well known amongst our experience. What it did, in part, was reinforce the logic of capitalism, right? That you have to do things to get things, that your stability is, at least in part, contingent upon how you are moving, how you are acting, what you say, how you are, right? And also implicit in that, not really stated, is, yeah, only some of us are going to be able to get a quality of life that is sustainable, and only some of us are going to have our needs met, and you don't want to be the other people who don't, right? And so that was sort of a, that lesson that I was taught as a young child sort of developed into a low self-esteem, because I never knew if I was valuable just as I was, right? I've since worked on that, right? But oftentimes, when you go into a space, it can either be avoidant, where it's low self-esteem and low belonging, where you kind of just avoid even engaging, right? You might isolate yourself, you might try to minimize interactions. And then if you have low belonging, but you have a high self-esteem, it's more of a, I feel like I'm that person, like I know my value, and people around me are weird and they don't really accept me. And it's almost an antagonistic or countercultural relationship that I frame as alienating, right? And then there's apologetic, which is there's high belonging, right? But there's, for whatever reason, a low self-esteem, right? So maybe you are closeted, maybe you're not out. Maybe you have been made fun of for being a little bit feminine if you were assigned male at birth, right? And you know that that's not valued in a hyper masculine space. It might be a sports team, it might be a church group or religious group or faith tradition. You know, there are other examples, and oftentimes in my experience and in my research and practice, people really resonate with the apologetic, right? Like, okay, I got to make sure that I'm constantly looking out and making sure I'm minimizing who I am, so that they don't find out, or I don't want to let my stuff fly too freely, because then I might put myself in danger of being reprimanded socially. They might withhold belonging. They might withhold acceptance of me. And so people oftentimes will self-suppress or repress, right? Parts of themselves. And over time that builds into resentment that ultimately will, it may lead to a sort of a leak that is then used as a pretense for exiting that community, right? And so these three positions, right, are very, very negative. Ideally, where we want to go is the top right quadrant, which is affirming, where there's space for people to exist as they are and to be accepted and affirmed as they are, and they also know intrinsically that however they show up, within reason, of course, they will be accepted, right? And this is what we saw with bringing it back to Maslow, the hierarchy of needs, right? Within the Siksika Blackfoot Nation, the idea that a person would be homeless or without a family was, to them in the 1940s, they didn't understand it because someone was always within family. Someone was always having their needs met. You always had a relationship with somebody, right? Even people who committed a crime in the Blackfoot Nation in the 1940s, the interpretation was, you committed that crime, you did something, we don't like that you did that thing, we love you, and we're going to work with you and give you a coach to work towards getting better integrated into this community so that you can pay back the debt and also keep being a part of the community, right? This is in stark contrast to our model, where if somebody does something that we don't approve of, we isolate them and we take them away from their families and we strip them of their agency, of their belonging, right, of their self-esteem. We then label them a criminal, right? And I talk about this because I think this gives us a good map of where we can go in terms of evaluating our cultures. And so these are just tools that I offer freely to people. And these are some other resources. There's a really great resource that I really appreciate. It's the Guide to Being an Ally to Trans and Non-Binary Young People. That was also a part of the Trevor Project that I appreciate, that I encourage people to look up. And the last thing that I'll share with you all is I want to keep in touch. I want people to know about the work that I'm doing. I want people to have language. I think that there's a lot of value in what I'm talking about and how I'm talking about it, and especially within workplaces, within teams, within organizations, within schools. A lot of people are very frightened to dive into these waters. And I think that my approach of using core needs offers a accessible and a sort of goal-oriented way of engaging in this work. And so with that, I encourage people either during the Q&A to scan this QR code, and that'll take you to a survey where you will be able to provide some feedback about this experience. And feedback is really important just to my practice. And I really value the time that you put into it. And with that, I'll take the close.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was wonderful. If anyone has any questions they would like to say via just coming on and turning on their mic, or if you would like to say it in the chat, we'll allow for a couple seconds, a couple minutes to do that. But if there are no questions, we'll conclude. So I'll just go ahead and give those couple moments.
I didn't see a way to take a survey from the QR code. It was just, unless I'm missing it, it's just a way to add you to contacts, which is great, and I did that.
Ah, okay, let me add that into the chat. Thank you for that.
Maybe
Thank you, Jody.
Yeah, maybe I'm just not seeing it from that QR code, but
Let me stop sharing. Okay, let me do that really quickly because that's important for me to offer up people the event. But you can also ask questions. Okay.
yeah, I don't have any questions, but I feel like I'm walking away more educated on the topic for sure. So I appreciate this call today.
Thank you.
And
That's
I
what
will also share the link to that survey in the replay, which will be in DEI offload.
Oh, great. Okay, super.
Right, Chris, and you can just
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. You can just send that to me via email, and I'll also email you. But again, thank you again for your amazing presentation, and thank you all for taking the time out of your day to join us. I'll also list Chris's contact information in the upload of that recording as well. All right, and everyone, you all have a great day. And again, thank you for joining us.
Yep,
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thanks,
This was
Chris.
really
Thanks, Sam.
good. Thank you,
Nice to
Chris.
meet
Thank
everybody.
you, everybody.
Same. Bye.
Did you want to check in or?
Give me 1 second, Chris.
Oh, no worries.